So hi guys, and welcome back again, or welcome if it's the first time you've watched it on YouTube or heard it on the various podcasting platforms. It's Too Many Cooks with me, Charles Burns, and today we have Daniel Larn as our wonderful guest. And I guess a really good place to begin, I read a bit of your biography, as I do with most guests that come on, and it's actually quite similar to mine in some respects, albeit we're from different worlds, right? You'll be more in the rural sort of world. I'm certainly more in the urban kind of centres. But you also had kind of young entrepreneurial flair from a young age. And one of the things I read about is that you also sold sweets at school. That was something that I did, right? So I asked this when I was being interviewed on another podcast of the day, but I think it has some mileage that some of these really early experiences that you have, you don't realize at the time why you're doing it. Maybe you did have a motivation to make money, maybe you didn't, I don't know. But I think when you look back, some of those things actually help, and sowing the seed is probably the right use of phrase for someone like yourself, given what we're going to talk about, of what eventually turned into a business. Do you look back now and think, oh, I see now certain things I learned from a young age, or not necessarily?
Yes and no. I mean, when we started doing that, it kind of it came about by accident, which I think is something that's quite similar to when a lot of people in later life start businesses and things. They kind of have a moment of realization and say, do you know what, this is a really good idea, or do you know what, I can go and do that. That was kind of how it came about. We just so happened that there was this shop around the corner from school that was kind of selling these. They were a particularly sour, like absolutely awful. They just used to ruin your face, make you cry. And we thought it was kind of funny, so we started buying them, and then we were giving them out to some of our friends at school, and then kind of watching them struggle with it. And then we found that people were wanting these things. So then that was when we started saying, well, okay, well, we'll go and we'll buy them, and then we can start to sell them. So that was how it came about. There was just this one thing that seemed to kind of get a little bit of traction, and we sort of started from there. Yeah.
So, and then again, something else that's got some familiarity with my story. You went to university in Plymouth. I didn't go there. I went to Birmingham. And then you stayed for 2 years and quit. I stayed for probably 2 weeks and quit. But still, still the college dropout kids. You studied merchant shipping, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I have an idea what that is, but I'm interested to know what that's about and what the study of it is.
Yeah. So essentially, merchant shipping is a full sort of honours degree course that you can do with the view to going into sort of the merchant navy. So you kind of go through. It's an accredited program. It's accredited by the MCA, which is essentially the DVLA for the marine industry in the UK. And you kind of go through, you get all of your professional certification as well as the academic qualification of the degree. It's kind of a course which I would recommend if you're kind of a vocationally focused kind of person. Maybe if you're not terribly academic, but you want to go out and do something, and maybe that you'd like to try and get to university. I would really recommend looking at that as a course to do, because one of the advantages of that is I actually got sponsored to go to university.
Oh, wow.
And I got to sort of go and travel and go and do all sorts of wonderful things because of this. That was largely why I did it. It was more for the experience of going to university, doing something that was quite interesting, rather than sort of just being a purely sort of academic thing.
And then the other thing, again, it's really interesting to me. You then you quit the university, and then chronologically, I imagine, then you became a surveyor in the oil and gas industry, which again, something that I know what the oil and gas industry is roughly. I think of like the North Sea oil rigs, and that's what I think of it. But I just need to know what the nuts and bolts of that job are like. And you mentioned traveling, and that sounds super interesting.
So you're quite right. I was sort of going through university, and one of the guys I was at university with, he was a mature student, and he was doing quite a lot of work in this particular field. You know, he was working as a surveyor out there whenever the university wasn't on. And he just sort of said, you know what, look, you could do this. Like, at the time, the oil price was, you know, sky high, and the market was booming. There was so much work going on that they couldn't find enough people to fill the positions that they needed. And he said, look, if you want to get into this as a career, like, now's the time to do it. They'll take you on because you've got kind of transferable skills. You know, you kind of know what you're talking about. And once you're in, if you get in and you get experience, and once you've got experience, then that's it. You know, all the other questions go out the window. You know, nobody's going to quiz you about anything. Once you've got experience, that's what you need. So I started there, and the work that we were doing was sort of seismic survey. So that is a vessel which kind of moves around the oil field, and they have these compressed air guns, we call them, but they don't sort of fire anything. They just make a bang in the water, and then we listen to the reflections that come off of all of the different subsurface layers, and we kind of map the oil fields and things like that. So yeah, I did that for a long time. I traveled quite a bit, a lot of sort of Europe, mostly obviously coastal areas, and I got to do some of Eastern Europe. We did a fantastic trip. We did Christmas in Romania, out in the sort of out there. We had a really interesting kind of crew change in Constanta, and also all sorts of wonderful experiences. It was a great time to kind of go out and enjoy stuff. You know, it really allowed you to kind of enjoy things because it paid well and you had a lot of time off. So you could really make the most of all the opportunities that you were given to travel in that time.
It's interesting as well because, you know, there's another parallel with my story, which is that you had correct if I'm wrong, obviously, a family farm, which I imagine was a business,
Yeah,
right? And then you went back to that following some time in the surveying of the oil and gas industry. I'm
yeah.
wondering, similarly to me, just kind of, you know, draw parallels. Was this family farm something that you always thought you were going to go into? Was it something that, as with my family business, at dinner tables, it would always be discussed and it was always part of the kind of the DNA of every conversation? Was it similar or was it not like that?
Um, yes, again, kind of yes and no. So one of the reasons why I went to do merchant shipping at university was because from a very young age, I was kind of adamant that I didn't want to be a farmer. Um, we only actually kind of moved to the farm full time when I was about 10 or 11. I mean, I obviously spent most of my time there growing up, but we moved to the farm full time when I was about 10 or 11.
Oh, so beforehand
Um,
you were living somewhere remotely and then he was working out.
yeah, yeah, that's it. Like, what it was is it's my grandfather's farm, really.
Oh, wow.
Um, and we kind of weren't farmers. Like, my mum, my dad, my mum was a teacher. My dad worked in the fire brigade in London, but the family farm was in Durham, in the northeast of England. Um, so you know, we weren't your typical farmer. You know, we weren't part of that kind of group of people. We didn't really have any farming friends. You know, we were as far removed from that as possible growing up, and I sort of saw a lot of I got to experience a lot of the good things that came from farming. You know, there's an awful lot of freedom, and it's a very rewarding job. But I also got to see from outside just how difficult it can be at times. You know, it can be a very tough and difficult way of life, and I saw how it kind of consumed, almost like what you're saying. You know, it kind of consumes everything in your life when you're there, and I didn't want that. But once I'd gone away and I was away from that from some time, I started to miss out on a lot of those things that I thought were really nice about the job, you know. And so when everything started to go downhill in the oil and gas market, and job security became um, very much a concern, I started making kind of backup plans. And because obviously I'd, you know, left university, I didn't have a degree, I only had my A levels to fall back on. By that point, I had, you know, a house with a mortgage and kids, so I kind of couldn't just go back and start again. I had to kind of I had to try and move sideways somehow, and the only other thing that I could really talk about with any authority was farming. And so I started trying to kind of give myself something of an education there, myself, you know, spending a lot of time reading and studying and learning from people, talking to people. And yeah, eventually I kind of stumbled upon an idea, took it to some people in the industry, and they sort of said, you know what, this is something quite interesting, and we think you should pursue it. And it just kind of grew from there, really.
I'm interested to know as well, because another bizarre parallel is that my family business as well came from my grandfather, right? And is there a stark difference between the farm that your grandfather set up and what you were farming versus what your dad then took it to be, and then where you've taken it now? Are they three very different things?
Um, well, in some ways, really, you know, what we're doing is kind of what I've gone on to do is kind of completely separate from the family farm. I'm still helping kind of develop the family farm and things, and that's really only now. I mean, nearly 20 years later, after we first moved there, that's only now starting to actually kind of leave my grandfather's grasp, and come over to us. And it's skipping a generation. So my sister's actually taking it on,
Okay.
and she wants to go and become a farmer. And yes, the way that they're doing things is so radically different to what was there before. Because I think that's what has to happen. I think it's good to offer that kind of clean boundary. I think, you know yourself, family business can be much more complex in a way than ordinary business.
I hope my grandfather and father listens to this, because it's so true.
It's much more complex. I mean, in some ways, it's far more risky, because there's more than just money on the line. You know, it's relationships, and not even just relationships with co-workers. They're relationships from birth. You know, it's your family, it's your siblings, it's your parents, it's your grandparents. But one of the things that we talked about was, for so long we were kind of in transition, but it never happened. And we got this idea, and we drew up these plans, and we said, look, this is it now. We're going to make a radical transition in a very short period of time, and it's going to end that chapter and start a new one. And because it is so radically different, you kind of everybody loses that ability to kind of compare one way to another, because it is different. You can't say, oh, I wouldn't have done it like that, or I wouldn't have done it like
This
this.
happens in our business.
Yeah, you know, having that nice crisp, you know, line in the sand,
Yeah.
where it's like, that's it, that's the end of that chapter. You know, this is what's happening now, this is what it's going to look like, this is where we make a start, and from this date forward we take it on. So yeah, that's happening back home now, and it's going really, really well so far. Oddly enough, again, we're starting a collection of videos and things that we're putting out to kind of document that whole process.
Brilliant.
Because I think that's quite quite an important part of business these days is the content that you create around it. I think anybody who isn't creating some form of content for their business is missing a trick. And I can
Yeah.
say that as the world's biggest hypocrite, because I don't do enough. I don't do enough.
You know, people are just super interested, particularly when it comes to like farming or any business now, as to who's behind it, what's their intentions, and and particularly with the world we're into now, people are starting to become a little bit frustrated with businesses and business owners that are just self-serving, and all they're in it for is just kind of make a profit. I think people want to see now, particularly with the globalized world we live in. I can buy, in my instance, a diamond ring from anywhere in the world. In your instance, if I'm a supermarket, I can look across the world for supplies of what it might be. So I
Yeah.
think it's super important to be able to have a brand, and not a brand necessarily just like this is our name or logo, etc., but actually like, you know, who are the people behind it? Like some people aren't that interested in that, but I think it's getting more and more so probably in the food space now, which we'll come on to absolutely, where people are really fascinated and almost they become experts themselves in, I want to know what's going in my body, what every ingredient is, where they've come from, I want to be able to track it and all these different things. But I'm interested though, in terms of your grandfather's farm, what was he actually farming? What particular, like, you know, vegetables, was it cattle? Like what was actually farming?
So for a long time, it was a sort of dairy farm. We were one of the first farms in the area to go to organic.
Okay.
We kind of pioneered that quite early on. You know, we championed organic quite early on. And then after foot and mouth disease in the sort of late 90s, there things started to change a little bit. You know, we weren't directly affected, but it caused all sorts of issues. And then we transitioned to beef shortly after I moved there full time. So, you know, around 2000. So for nearly 20 years, we've been a beef farm. So we do our own now, grass-fed, 100% organic, Aberdeen Angus, and
Nice.
it's going really well. Going really well.
Brilliant. And then so you've gone. So what's the kind of the new techniques that you're employing? And I think that also comes nicely into this company that you've got called Willard. Is it Willand?
Willand Group. Yeah, no, it's
Willand
okay.
Group, sorry. And yeah. So how do those things link together, and what's it all about?
Okay, so it started off. One of the big challenges for people who want to get into agriculture at the moment is exactly that. It's how to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
Famously, you have to be born into it or marry into it. Those are really the two ways that people typically get into farming. And for me, like I say, I kind of had this job and I was looking to go back to doing something else. And I said, right, farming's great, but I want to try and do away with all the things that I used to not like about farming.
What sort of things are they?
It's things like and again, I should say that this isn't necessarily all farms, you know, not all farms are the same, but it was things like the constant lack of like working capital. If something went wrong on the farm, it meant upheaval of a major sort of way to try and get things sorted out. There was always I don't know, it was really complicated. We didn't have the right tools and equipment, which meant that any job that you had to do became, one, much more complex, two, much more time consuming, and actually much more costly.
Okay.
Third was the fact that the way that the farm was ran, it meant that it needed more people than it could support there all hours of the day. You know, 24/7, there had to be 3 people there to be able to do all the different things. But in reality, it could only really provide a few hours work for all 3 of those people.
From an economic standpoint.
Yeah, it just didn't make sense. You know, if everybody was taking a proper salary out of it for the work that they were doing,
Mm-hmm.
it would just have collapsed. You
Right.
know, it was only because farmers don't really do that. They kind of just do it for for the love of it a lot of the times.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of them won't admit that tends to be the case.
Yeah.
And I said, that's just not me. I didn't want to do that. I still wanted to be able to get away and do a holiday, or to not have to worry if if we wanted to go and do a day trip somewhere and go out and do something with family or whatever, we could. So I started looking for a way to start my own farm, and run it much more like a business. Uh, I say to a lot of people now that the best farmers out there are ex-accountants. Those guys really know how to farm. The idea for me was to create something that took as little capital to start as possible and would give me that flexibility. So I started looking at these kind of more intensive sort of beef finishing systems. That's what I was looking at. But it didn't quite sit right with me, as much as I'm quite informed about the merits of intensive animal agriculture. It's not all as bad as it's made out to be, genuinely. I still didn't quite like the idea of it. I do still like the very kind of picturesque image of it, and so
you're referring to like intensive being like more like a factory and a production line versus
yeah, I don't
grazing around and stuff.
Yeah, I don't like to call it factory farming, because that kind of has this real
Negative connotations.
Yeah, it just instantly makes everybody a little bit nervous,
I was just using
when
that
they
terminology to kind of to compare the two, but if
yeah,
I'm
no, I know. Don't worry about it. So I don't like to use that term, and we were very careful. One of the phrases that everybody in the actual industry throws around is they talk about sustainable intensification.
Mm-hmm.
They say, well, it's better for the environment, it's better for the animals, it's better for the quality of food and the amount of food that they produce, it's better for the consumers as well. And I said, yeah, but when you say sustainable intensification, it's nice, but that animal element, that's kind of being removed from these kind of systems. And that's what everybody sees when they look at the kind of the intensive farming, the images of intensive farming and things. Everybody says, well, it's heartbreaking. Which in many cases it is, actually. I won't deny. So we set about trying to create something we called sensitive intensification,
Mm-hmm.
which was very much more about trying to get to where we're meeting those goals of sustainable intensification, but making as many concessions as we can to make the actual environment in these places be something much better than the traditional intensive farming systems.
So the animal kind of welfare and stuff is more of a priority than it was previously.
That's it. And again, it's not even animal welfare, because animal welfare in terms of the physical well-being of animals, actually those intensive units have a much higher standard of welfare than most other farms, from a purely objective viewpoint. But it's kind of, in truth, it's really difficult for us to kind of put a finger on exactly what it is. One of the ways that we describe it is we say, well, it can't look like a farm, and it can't smell like a farm. Because when you go to these intensive units, we went out to look at some equipment, some feed equipment on a farm in Holland. And, there's so much ammonia in the air in these buildings, it makes your throat sore, it makes your eyes water. The room is so kind of dark and dusty. It's not a nice environment at all. You wouldn't want to be in there.
Yeah.
And that, really made us sort of second guess what we were doing. And we said, but we've got to make it different. We've got to show that you can have all the benefits of a system like this, but have loads of natural light, have no ammonia, have the best possible environment, have plants in there, have something approaching. The way that we sold it to people in the early days was we said we wanted to build the Eden project for cows.
Okay.
That was what we set out to do. We wanted to create an artificial environment in a bubble that we could put animals in. So they had something approaching that outdoor life, but with all the benefits of it being indoor. And so that was what we set out to build, and that's what we've done.
That makes a lot of sense. And where does artificial intelligence come into play here, and how do you use that, and what are the benefits that you're seeing?
So for us, artificial intelligence comes into it at sort of two levels. We have a sort of farm level system, which is continually optimizing the processes for the farm unit. So that is looking at monitoring the performance of the animal. It's looking at monitoring the quality of feed, the amount of water, the amount of activity, how much they move around, all sorts of things. Sorry, my daughter's yeah. So we're putting into these buildings all kinds of different sensors and various technologies that are monitoring every single aspect that we can. We spent a long time going out and meeting with all of these usually much smaller technology companies that are manufacturing new and different sensors.
Yeah.
We're collating all of this information, and in a true kind of big data machine learning kind of way, everything is being put into a database, and the system is constantly trying to optimize all those processes for each individual animal. So if one particular animal, say, goes in, and let's look at the dairy system. Dairy systems are quite good because we're getting multiple measures of productivity per day. Every time the animal comes in and gets milked, we're sort of seeing what's happening.
Right.
The animal goes in, she gets milked. We see how much milk that animal has produced. We see how much fat and protein is in the milk, how much sugar, all those kinds of things.
Yep.
We can then look at that and say, okay, that animal is producing milk at that much. We know how much energy it takes for that animal at that weight to produce that amount of milk. Therefore, we are overfeeding that animal by X amount. Therefore, we can reduce the amount of feed that we need to give that animal, or vice versa. That animal's producing that much milk. If we feed her X amount, she can produce X amount more. And it's constantly trying to balance the cost of inputs versus the value of the outputs.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it works on a farm level. But then we step up to the next level, which is looking at the supply chain. So now the customer for this might be somebody like, in the dairy instance, it might be an Arla or a Muller,
Yep.
A big commercial dairy that has hundreds of thousands of farms. They can now see into their supply chain, and they can see what farms are doing, how farms are managing everything. If you look at much more integrated schemes, like you might get in pigs or poultry,
Mm-hmm.
some of those systems, they're actually, bulk buying hundreds of thousands of tons of feeds and grains and things like that. So whereas on that system that's running on a farm level, it kind of going into that minutiae, it makes that farm run more efficiently, and that's great. But when you take those small gains at that level out to that supply chain level, then that starts to add up to sort of significant sums of money.
Yeah.
We are looking at expanding the system to start to even do various sort of predictive analysis, so we can sort of say, okay, because there is a drought in this particular region, that's going to affect the price of some of the inputs by X amount in so many months' time. Therefore, your cost of production is going to be X in so many months' time. You need to buy X amount of grain now in order to offset that. You know, we're trying to look at that. We're applying an awful lot of industrial economics. That's a lot of it is taken from heavy industry, things like the steel industry. We're borrowing a lot of their kind of economic tools,
Mm-hmm.
and applying them in this new kind of industry, which is kind of the theme for what we've done. Everything that we're doing, we're sort of taking from various other industries and packaging it together into something new.
On the technology front as well, I don't know if this is something you're looking into or have plans in place for, but something that I am quite interested in is blockchain. And for people that don't know, blockchain is not just Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all these different currencies. It's actually like a large database or ledger whereby you can track things. That's the best way I can describe it, I suppose. So I'm just wondering, because I know I've seen IBM have worked with a company to track, this is a year or two ago, they tracked a like a ton of oranges, or sort of certain amount of oranges, and they could show exactly where it had been, how long it had been there, and show the exact supply chain. And that could have and will have, I know Dinona into this as well, far-reaching implications as to once you can figure out how to utilize that. So have you kind of looked into it, and what have you found so far?
Yeah, so it's a hot topic. It really is. You know, it's one of those things that always comes up at the kind of industry events and things. You know, we sit on a few kind of innovation panels and things, and it's something that's always being talked about. One of the problems that's one of the things that's kind of preventing it from getting into the industry at the moment is the fact that nobody's really sure how they can apply it. You know, how it's going to actually get in there and start making a difference. Sorry, everybody sees the value of what blockchain can bring to the supply chain. The issue is how they can actually implement it. Everything kind of works from farm level to, say, the boning hall in, you know, a meat plant. Everything works, but once you start to break these huge blocks of, you know, a ton of grain or an animal carcass or something down into its constituent parts, it literally falls apart. How do you track everything through that system
Yeah.
in a way which doesn't limit the productivity of that process? We could do it if we slowed the whole process down and really tracked everything going through that, but we can't do that. You know, that's a very, very costly
Yeah.
step. So what everybody is trying to do now is they're looking at how they can manage that transition before it goes from, you know, the bulk element down to the kind of packaged good, the final thing that goes off to the supermarket. That transition for many products is quite a challenge. You know, it's not the same for everything. You mentioned oranges before. Fruits and things probably can be done. Whether they could be done at scale yet, you know, commercially, I don't know. But that's the big stumbling block in the industry at the moment, I think.
Interesting. And then I guess a nice way to move on, you talk about part of what you're doing with your company is improving food security and also helping emerging economies. How are you doing those two things?
So we're doing a lot of work on projects out in Africa at the moment. We're getting some things going out there, which is, it's a really challenging environment for animal agriculture. And, you know, their productivity is incredibly low. For example, Nigeria, the average dairy cow in Nigeria produces 1 litre of milk per day.
Okay.
An average animal in the UK is going to produce 35 litres. You know,
Seriously, that
some
different.
of the more productive animals will produce 40 or more litres per day. You know, as
Wow,
an
wow.
average, we're about 35 litres per day in the UK.
Bear with me a second. Sorry, hold on.
So there's a major difference in terms of productivity, and that comes about from a number of different factors. Predominantly, there's a real environmental burden. So again, looking at dairy animals, once the temperature gets above, say 16 degrees C here in the UK,
Yeah.
the productivity of the dairy herd in the UK begins to drop quite significantly
Okay.
because it's too hot. You know, the animals can't handle that much heat. The tropical kind of breeds, you know, the native breeds of places like Africa and India and Asia, they do cope with the heat a little bit better.
Yeah.
But the kind of the optimal range for ruminant or certainly bovine animals for cattle is between sort of -10 and about +8 degrees. So
Okay.
within that range, they're very, very happy, very, very productive. But it doesn't often get that cold in Africa. You know,
Yeah.
they tend to have those much higher temperatures year round and much higher humidity as well, which means that the animal has to put an awful lot of energy into regulating its own body temperature, which it
Mhm.
can't then put towards producing milk.
I see. I see.
So that's one of the things that we're doing. We're providing these, like I said to you before, these bubbles that have this kind of controlled environment inside, so that we can give the animals in there the best possible chance of achieving their full, what we term the genetic potential.
Mhm.
You know, the sort of the maximum theoretical productivity of the animal. You then start to, once we have that in place, again, our AI system and all these other things that we're doing can look to further improve the productivity by changing the nutrition. We can modify the nutrition and things like that to try and improve productivity. We can even start to look at the genetics of the animal. So we can look at not necessarily replacing the native breeds with exotic breeds, like, you know, breeds from Europe.
Mhm.
We can actually look at selectively breeding the animals that are within the country already to gradually improve the genetic merit of the herd. So that's kind of a huge part of what Will and Group are doing there. We've got a few projects on the go across Africa, in Nigeria, Rwanda, Ghana, and a few others. So yeah, we're hoping that in the next couple of years we'll really start to be able to make a difference out there, because it's really important out there. You know, animals are, as much as a significant portion of the population might want us to kind of do away with sort of animal agriculture. Um, Unfortunately, it's just not really possible. I mean, we're actually starting to struggle in parts of the UK now because there isn't enough animal agriculture. Cambridge is, and sort of that part of the country there, they have a distinct lack of organic matter in the soil,
Right.
and they can't get enough of it. They're now having to import uh, slurries and manures and things from all over the country to try and rejuvenate the soils, because it's traditionally been a very arable part of the country now for so long. Um, Animals are a part of the natural process, you know, and we can't do without them. Unfortunately, we can't produce more vegetables and fruits and things without having the animals there as well. It's quite important that they play that part. And when you've got much more or conditions that are much less conducive to productivity, those sort of equatorial and tropical regions, it becomes even more important to have them as part of that process.
What do you think, because you touched on something there, what do you now make of these companies like Memphis Meats in the States have got 150 million of funding recently for cell-grown meat? What's your view on that? And then what's also your view on the kind of quote-unquote fake meats, the Beyond Meat burgers that Bill Gates has invested a chunk of money into as to move us away from animal protein?
I think it's not a bad thing. Not by any means is it a bad thing. I certainly think that people probably should consume less meat, for sure. And the meat that people consume, they should probably look at consuming more quality meat rather than just whatever's sort of the cheapest. But in truth, I think that those sorts of things, even if they can get all of the technological challenges out of the way, they're a long way away from being adopted en masse. I think maybe in Europe and North America, where the culture is such that adoption would be quite, or I think, relatively easy.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start talking about the Far East and Africa, and those countries that have an emerging middle class, this new wealth that's like emerging in these countries, they want meat, and they want real meat, and it's part of the culture, and they're much more associated and much more connected with food than we are in the more developed markets, and so I think that there's a real problem with, and it's certainly been my experience from many conversations that I've had. I can't present any data on this by any means, but everybody seems to believe that it's definitely more a first world problem, and a first world solution.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work everywhere. So yeah, all the power to them. And I mean, I've actually encountered quite a few of them now, and there's some really interesting and exciting work going on there.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried my first Beyond Burger just a couple of weeks ago, and it was very, very good. Not quite the same, different,
Yes.
but not bad at all. Not
Yeah.
bad at all.
Agreed. I think a nice way to kind of cap this off, and it'd be remiss of me not to mention it, but with the coronavirus, the COVID-19 at the moment of time, what implications they're having on farming that you're seeing? You've got your data which shows things, and what will be the implications, positive or negative, going forwards?
There's been a few discussions about it lately. Some things have really surprised everybody in the industry. I think there's a huge shortage of eggs across the country.
Okay.
A lot of places are struggling to get flour in stock. Somebody shared an article on LinkedIn the other day that was saying that it was all to do with people stress baking, which is something that I've never heard of before.
I think as well, people have got kids at home and they're looking for things to do, and they're baking takes time, it's rewarding, and all the rest.
That's it. I think that it is certainly highlighting the fragile nature of the supply chain. Everybody was panic buying toilet roll. You don't know how desperate you are until you run out of toilet roll and you can't find any anywhere. It's one of those things. I think people take for granted just what it takes to produce a lot of the stuff that we eat. And we've become very used to having it easy. A figure that I can throw out is the fact that now we spend something like, I think it's something about 6 or 7% of our monthly household income on food now,
Mm-hmm.
as an average. whereas 30 odd years ago, it was something like 35%.
Yeah.
So we're consuming an awful lot more, but we're paying so much less for it. The
Is that
way that
supermarket pressure and consortium buying, is that being the killer?
it it is. It's not necessarily a killer. I mean, farming is so much more productive now.
Right.
But the problem that we have is that how we've gotten to that level of productivity wasn't really sustainable. And so now we're far more dependent upon chemicals and that sort of uh, intensive system of agriculture, even though it's within an arable setting. There is now something of a renaissance in the UK for almost taking a step back to how farming was back in even the sort of pre-war period. There's a sort of a return to people practicing mixed farming, which has, pretty much disappeared entirely back in the 80s and 90s. And lots of people are looking at regenerative practices. So rather than things like ploughing, which is great for, preparing seed beds and making sure that what seed you drill is going to be the most productive.
Yeah.
But it takes so much out of the soil. It contributes to soil erosion and flooding and all those sorts of things. There's people now are moving to what they call min-till, or which is essentially ploughing as little as possible. Or some farms even go all the way to no-till, where they don't plough at all and they just drill seed directly into the ground.
Okay.
People are looking at intercropping and much more diverse crop cycles and things like that. There are so many things that farmers are now trying to do to grow food in a much more environmentally conscious way, much more sustainable way. But the problem with that is it is less productive, and it does make it, in most cases, more expensive to produce.
Yeah.
And as much as consumers say that they like organic and they like free range and they like, all that good stuff, all the data that is there says that actually most of them are purely driven by price.
Yeah. I had a
So
similar conversation or thought process with, say, what's happened with Weatherspoons is a great example where, everyone's like, oh, that, he's not been paying his staff and it's been horrible to them. And like, oh, once this is over, like, we're going to boycott it. Well, my argument is, well, the price of a pint is dictating people will go there because that's what they can afford. And people are very price sensitive. So I see that in a number of ways.
yeah, it is. If you look at it, it's the same in almost every sector. I mean, I'm sure. I had a conversation with a friend of mine once about something you might be more familiar with. Like, he was buying an engagement ring.
Yeah.
And his wife wanted just the biggest diamond that they could get. And so they ended up with this diamond, and he said it's not. He said it almost doesn't even look like a diamond.
They just went for size over kind of quality.
It was size over quality, and I went the other way when I proposed to my wife. I went for quality over the sort of sheer size of it.
That's what I did also.
And it's the same sort of discussion. People want as much as they can for as little as possible, and one of two things has got to change. You've either got to change the quality of the product, or you've got to change how that product was produced. You've got to change obviously it doesn't quite work with diamonds, but for many other processes it's the same. They're cutting costs somewhere to meet that demand. The supermarkets run very low margins on that sort of stuff, and it's purely about the volume that they can sell, and that's forced farmers to go in the same direction. Farms are getting bigger and bigger, and the smaller farms are disappearing. and everything is becoming much more industrialized. So hopefully this new wave of sort of thinking within the industry now is going to take people back to a much more sort of nuanced, much more delicate way of producing food. But one of the big challenges is trying to get the consumers then engaged with that and get them understanding of that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant place to leave it. And I'm sure at some other point, I'd love to talk to you about some of the projects you've got ongoing, which seem very, very interesting as well. And
Always here.
Yeah, I wish you all the best with the work you're doing over in the kind of emerging economies in Africa, etc. is phenomenal, and also obviously your UK operations as well. Thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Yeah, you too, Charles. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Goodbye, everyone.